morning. How are you all? Let's make sure we have our, okay, let's see. I think I may need a tech person to assist me here for a second. Are we good? Okay. All right. So we should be on a timer here. Okay, no, we're not good. Okay, so if we don't get kicked out here, then we should be okay. First I want to thank Danielle for the introduction, and I want to thank the Southern Utah University community for the warm welcome. I had dinner at the president's house yesterday and have had a chance to see a little bit of this campus. And so I'm a New Yorker, and I'm an East Coast person, and so when I kind of landed and I was like, mountains, I'm still kind of like, still have like that kind of child sense of wonder about these things. And so and this is also my first time in Utah. So whatever happens here will be my impression of the entire state of Utah. So no pressure at all. But no, I've felt very welcome here, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk with you this morning. So we live in interesting times, and we have there are a couple of things that I do. I'm a historian and I'm a journalist, and for a long time in my life I thought that those two things were at odds, that I was supposed to pick one thing and focus on it. And then at some point in my life I came to realize that the historical part of me, and also these images behind me will just cycle through. At the very end we'll talk about what they are, and I'm not going to walk through each image, but we'll talk about how they all fit together. But at some point I came to realize that the historical part of me contextualized journalism, and the journalistic part of me showed the implications of the history that I was interested in writing about and understanding. And so in looking at the world through those two gauges, I've had a great deal to think and say over the past several months, really over the past 2 years or so now, in relationship to what we've seen happening in our politics, in our society, and kind of the fabric of our democracy. Just this past weekend, we saw a gentleman of Indian descent who was murdered by someone who told him to quote, get out of his country. And it was notable that this happened. The person was Indian, but was mistaken for an Iranian. And when I read this story, it reminded me that several years ago in Wisconsin, there had been 6 people who were killed in a Sikh temple by someone who mistook them for Muslim. And then I also remembered that in Kansas, there had been an attack on a Jewish cultural center a few years back, in which a person was attempting to kill Jews, and he shot and fatally wounded 3 Christians who happened to be attending an event at this center. And then I remembered that a little bit earlier, a little bit before that, in 2009, there was an incident at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., in which someone had come there and he intended to attack Jewish people, and he'd begun shooting, and the person whom he hit had been an African-American security guard who was working there. And I thought this was all germane, I thought it was all pertinent, because it reminded me of what Martin Luther King said when he talked about the inextricable web of mutuality, saying that we're all bound by this. And Dr. King said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And this is not kind of rhetorical or hypothetical. we can see it is no better to say that you killed these people accidentally, because that would validate the idea that there are groups of people who should be subject to this kind of violence. But we also understand that none of us is safe if one of us is in jeopardy, and this kind of connection we have. And so I think a good deal and write a good deal about race. And it informs my thinking in particular ways. And I found it to be integral to understanding how the United States has come to be what it is and how we find ourselves in the moment that we presently inhabit. This was made more clear to me than I would imagine just a few weeks ago. So I spent part of December and January, about 3 weeks in total, in Charleston, South Carolina. I was there writing about the trial of Dylan Roof. He is the young man who, as a 21-year-old in 2015, walked into the sanctuary of the Emmanuel AME Church and gunned down 9 members of the church because they were black, for no reason other than the color of their skin. And I was in Charleston for the trial. And it was a difficult experience because we had to walk through the horror and the trauma of what happened that night. And even trying to be detached as a professional, it was difficult to witness this and kind of hear the testimony of people who had been in the building but survived, to see the crime scene footage, which is as horrific as you would imagine, to see the grief and trauma of the family members of people who had been killed in the church. And we all had this kind of secondary trauma, the journalists, the sketch artists, the people working in the court, in terms of having walked through this ordeal with them. And in the midst of this, I met a gentleman by the name of Malcolm Graham. He is a former state senator in North Carolina, but more pertinently, he is the brother of a woman by the name of Cynthia Graham Hurd, who was one of the victims in the church. And he had taken it as his mission to make sure that the world understood just how important and wonderful a person his older sister had been. She was a librarian. She had given years of dedicated service to the Charleston Public Library System, and she had also worked in the College of Charleston University Library System. And she was a passionate advocate of literacy and was always giving people books and suggesting books that people should read. She was a person who had found their cause in life and was eager to help people in her community anytime she had the opportunity. And this is what he spoke of. We had lunch one day, and he spoke about his sister in these terms. He wanted people to understand who she was. And so at the end of the trial, Mr. Roof was convicted of all 33 counts. He received, I think, 9 life sentences and 18 death penalty sentences. And kind of irrespective of how you feel about the death penalty, it is still kind of jarring to hear someone sentenced to death 18 times in a row. And this is kind of the parting moment, for this trial. And so I leave the next morning. I literally booked the next flight, the earliest flight that I could get. And so at 6 a.m., I got up about 3:30 in the morning. I got to the airport by 5 a.m. 6 a.m., I was on a flight to New York. And I landed in New York at LaGuardia Airport, then went from LaGuardia Airport to JFK Airport. And anyone who's ever visited New York knows it's not as simple as I just said. That doesn't happen easily. But I managed to make that happen. I got to JFK, and there I boarded a flight where I went from New York to San Francisco and had an engagement, a meeting that evening. And so when I landed in San Francisco, I was kind of irritable. I had been in the air most of the day, and I still had kind of Charleston in the back of my mind. And when I got to my hotel, I hopped in a taxi, I went to my hotel, and I realized that I had not spoken to anyone over the course of the day. And I just casually struck up a conversation with the bellman in the lobby of my hotel. And so just kind of making small talk, I asked him if he was originally from San Francisco. This is an African-American man who was maybe in his mid-30s. And he said, I've been in San Francisco for 2 years, but I'm originally from Charleston, South Carolina. And so that kind of struck me. And I said, well, that's interesting. I'm coming from Charleston. And he said, well, what brought you to Charleston? And I said, I was there writing about the trial of Dylann Roof. And then a stricken look passed over his face. And he said, that man took away someone very important to me. And I said, who? And he said, my childhood librarian. Her name was Cynthia Graham Hurd. And so I was struck by this. It was kind of unbelievable to me because I had started that morning just maybe in a hotel that was maybe a half mile from the Atlantic Ocean. And I'd ended that evening just maybe less than a mile from the Pacific Ocean. And I'd had this idea that I was going to leave behind Charleston in Charleston. And yet it came to pass that the first person who I talked to on the opposite side of the country, as far away as I could get from Charleston without leaving the borders of the United States, the first person I spoke to had been directly impacted by what happened. And so when I wrote about this, and I wrote about it for the New Yorker, I said, the boundaries of this tragedy can't be confined to one geographic locale. Instead, it conforms perfectly to the boundaries of the country in which it happened. And so when I think about the relationship of the United States to the issue of race, it's reasons like this that make it integral to me, integral to our understanding, that we can't understand the country unless we understand this relationship with race. When we go back to the origins of the United States and those founding documents, the original version of the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson lists that litany of concerns that give the basis for the colonies separating from the British Crown, he mentions the transatlantic slave trade. He calls it an execrable traffic in human beings. And he says that with these people having done nothing to warrant this, they have been transported to the colonies, and if they rise up in anger, seeking their freedom, it will be the colonies that suffer for it when they have had no hand in actually creating the state of affairs. Jefferson actually says this, issues this moral condemnation of the slave trade, the original version of the Declaration of Independence. The version of the Declaration that everyone signs, however, has no such reference. And so in that moment, we effectively see this question of black freedom being copy-edited out of the founding document of the United States. And then we move a little bit further, and we go to the United States Constitution, which is the blueprint for American democracy. And yet, within that blueprint, we find these clauses that are intended to preserve racial hierarchy. One is the 3/5 compromise, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But in short, it allows people to count the enslaved population when it comes to representation. As we know, your representation in the House of Representatives is determined by the size of the population in your state. Southern states are allowed to count 3/5 or 60% of the enslaved population toward representation in Congress. And this is in the wake of a war that was fought over the issue of taxation without representation. And so we have a population that is forbidden, it is impossible for them to participate in the political system, yet they are counted when it comes to representation for white Southerners. We have the Fugitive Slave Clause, which says that if an individual is able to escape the institution of slavery and find his or her way to a free territory or free state, the people of that state are duty-bound to return that individual to the institution of slavery. This is within the Constitution. And we also have the transatlantic slave clause, the protection of the slave clause. So for 20 years, it says that for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution, the slave trade cannot be outlawed. And so we find race implicit within the founding documents of the United States. If we move beyond that into the physical makeup of the country itself, we can't understand our own geography if we don't understand this relationship. And so last year, I gave a talk in Maine. And when I got to Maine, I was greeted very nice people, and in the midst of giving my talk, I mentioned, I said, this state only exists because of slavery, racism. And people were quiet for a second, and then they remembered the Compromise of 1820. So we remember that Missouri wanted to enter the Union. There were 11 slave states and 11 free states. Missouri wanted to enter as a slave state. Were it to do so, it would have tipped the balance in favor of slave states, giving them 2 more senators and a number more representatives in the House who were in favor of the institution of slavery. And this was disagreeable to northern and free states. And so the compromise that Henry Clay comes up with is that they carve this other state out of Vermont. And this is where we get Maine. And so Maine and Missouri are allowed to enter the Union in 1820 out of this compromise. And people were like, yeah, that's right, that's true. And I left Maine and flew to Florida. And I spoke with a group at Florida State University. Again, very nice people. And I told them what I told the people in Maine. And they were like, wow, that's too bad. And I said, well, before you get too smug, Florida became a U.S. possession because in 1819, an upstart general by the name of Andrew Jackson marched into what was then a Spanish territory and seized it. And he did so at the behest of slaveholders in Georgia and South Carolina. So the narrative that we know when we talk about slavery is about people trying to escape to the north and or Canada. But it's a little bit more complicated because prior to 1820, if you were a person who was enslaved in the Deep South, you tried to flee further south because it was known that the Spanish would not return enslaved people to slavery in Georgia and South Carolina. And so because this is a monetary loss, because people incur monetary losses, significant monetary losses, when I talk with my students, this is an imperfect analogy, but when I talk with my students, I say that the value associated with a human being could have been anywhere from $1,200 to $1,500 in their prime, which is a substantial amount of money now, but in 19th century terms, this was the equivalent of a fairly high-end car. And so certainly no one would just walk out and say, hey, my Lexus is gone, and then your neighbor says, my Lexus is gone, and someone else says, my Mercedes is gone, and then you just go, oh, well, that just happens. People would want some sort of recourse. It is at the behest of these slaveholders that Andrew Jackson marches into Florida, without, by the way, the permission of President Monroe. And so if we went further west, if we went to California, we'd know that California entered the Union in 1850 as a result of a compromise, the Compromise of 1850. And that compromise, in exchange for California's admission to the Union, was that southern states got a stronger Fugitive Slave Act. As a matter of fact, we created an agency, an actual federal bureaucracy responsible for tracking down and returning individuals to slavery. Where the Constitution had simply said that it was obligated that a person be returned to slavery, by 1850 we actually have a federal agency that is responsible for tracking down fugitives. And so we find this kind of connected to California. Or we could talk about Texas, where there's a similar dynamic. And we could talk about those states that are carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. And the fact that we talk very much about Jefferson getting a fire sale deal on this territory when he negotiates with Napoleon. We don't talk about the fact that Napoleon was in the mood to give up all of his Western Hemisphere holdings because he was so disgusted by the losses he incurred as a result of the Haitian Revolution, which was the largest scale slave revolt in the Western Hemisphere. And so this expansion of the United States, this doubling of the size of the United States, is directly connected to these transatlantic events, specifically around slavery and the slave revolt in Haiti. And so the physical geography of our country reflects these racial attitudes and racial prerogatives. When I was in Charleston, one of the more affecting pieces of testimony came from a woman by the name of Felicia Sanders. She talked about her son, Tywanza. He had been shot while in the church. Miss Felicia Sanders was there. She survived by playing dead. And she did so in order to, she literally laid her body over her granddaughter and pretended to have been shot. And this meant that she was able to save her granddaughter's life, but it meant she was unable to help her son, who was wounded and just nearby. And she witnessed her son in the midst of this shooting spree stand up. He'd already been shot. He stood up and asked, why are you doing this? You don't have to do this. And Mr. Roof responded, I have to, because you all are raping our women and taking over the world. This is what he says. It was notable to me that he justified this atrocity in the language of defending white women from black rapists. Just exactly a century before this, in 1915, the film Birth of a Nation was released. Now, when we talk about this film, we tend to focus on two things about it, two aspects of it. The first is that it is the kind of forebear of American cinematic history. That D.W. Griffith made technical innovations. It is the first blockbuster in American history, that he brought techniques to bear that became the cornerstone for early American filmmaking, and that we cannot understand American cinema without understanding the contributions of D.W. Griffith, and specifically in this film, Birth of a Nation. The other reason we talk about it is that we see it as a kind of perfect encapsulation of racism at the beginning of the 20th century. The film is a kind of romantic love letter to the KKK. And it depicts the history of Reconstruction and what came after it. And in Griffith's telling, Reconstruction is a complete, terrible failure. There are black people who are given political office after the end of slavery, and they are given kind of superior standing to whites, and that the Ku Klux Klan rises up to redeem the white race in the South. More specifically, the narrative tells the story of two families, the Stonemans and the Camerons. One is from the North, one is from the South. The Northern family has a more liberal attitude on questions of race, and the Southern family has an attitude that is more typical of white Southerners at that point in time. And it is not until a black man attempts to rape the daughter of the Northern family that they come to understand that Southerners have been right about race all along. And this is why he calls it Birth of a Nation, because the film was released on the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And he is making a proposal that the lingering resentments, that the national fracture between the North and the South can be cemented through the bond of their common contempt for black people. And in the Northern family, recognizing the menace of black people, you find a kind of reconciliation. And so the racist depiction of African Americans, the glorification of the Ku Klux Klan. There are lots of things we could find that were disagreeable about that film, but none of them are as disturbing as the fact that Griffith was largely right, that he kind of predicted the way race would operate for the remainder of the 20th century in the United States. He was pretty much accurate. So there was an image that just went past and said, we want white tenants in our white community. And I always ask people, when I talk, to take a guess where the image comes from. Anyone? Cicero, Illinois, Chicago? Georgia? The North? Oh, that's interesting. Usually, so this is what happens when I do this. This is a kind of a different feedback. Usually, when I ask people, especially when I show this image to students, they'll assume Mississippi. It's the first place they guess, like always Mississippi, to the point where you actually feel a little bit bad for Mississippi. And I was trying to explain this to someone, and once they were like, why did they always pick Mississippi? And I was like, well, Mississippi has this reputation for being kind of like the New York Yankees of American racism. And so then people will guess Alabama, Tennessee, kind of the states of the former Confederacy. But Cicero, Illinois is an interesting guess, and it is not Cicero, but it is Detroit. And now we kind of identify Detroit, and we think of Detroit as a city that we think of synonymously as having a significant African-American population. But this was in 1942. In 1920, Detroit's population was 96% white. And over the next 20 years, the black population quadruples, which creates this sort of tension in the North where people start seeing signs that you might associate with the South. And so when Griffith says that Northerners will begin to respond to race the way that Southerners have for many years, he's actually making an accurate prediction of how this will play out. And more specifically, we see this dynamic of progress and backlash, the two of them intimately interwoven on the subject of race. And so in this country, we have a bloody 4-year war, the Civil War, that settles the question of slavery in one regard. We have over 700,000 casualties in the Civil War. I tell my students that if we were to, in order to get the number of casualties that we experienced in the Civil War in 19th century warfare, we would have to fight World War II almost 3 times. We'd have to fight Vietnam, I think, 13 times. And so this was a tremendously bloody affair. And out of it, we get the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. And the end of slavery is followed by Reconstruction, which is this time period in which we see over 600 African Americans elected to political office in the South. And then by the end of Reconstruction in 1877, we see a violent uprising to reinstitute black subordination and to remove African Americans from the political process and to end the experiment with multiracial democracy in the American South. And then in the beginning of the 20th century, as a result of industrialization and urbanization and the demands for laborers to meet the needs of World War I, we begin to see something that comes to be known as the Great Migration. In total, between 3 and 5 million African Americans leave the South. They go from the South to the North, from the South to the Midwest, from rural communities into urban communities, completely transforms the demographics of the United States. And people leave in pursuit of educational opportunity. They pursue better employment. In short, they are able to participate in the political system. But in short, we begin to see this dynamic of backlash reassert itself. And we witness a spate of race riots and violence, and racially motivated violence. And people refer to the Red Summer of 1919, where there are race riots that are punctuating American cities. The NAACP, as a matter of fact, owes its existence to a race riot that happens in 1909 in Springfield, Illinois. And this was particularly shocking because this is the adopted home of Abraham Lincoln. And so there's a concern that if we are seeing this kind of racial violence in the North and in the city that Lincoln called home, that we're seeing the nationalization of the race, quote unquote, race problem. And so we just ended Black History Month, February. Black History Month owes its existence to a historian by the name of Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Woodson was the son of two former slaves, and he earned a PhD in history at Harvard University. In 1926, he created something called Negro History Week to promote the discussion and examination of questions relating to African Americans. On the 50th anniversary of Negro History Week, the organization he founded, although he had passed away by that point, but the organization he founded expanded it to Black History Month. But Dr. Woodson almost never lived, almost didn't make it, almost didn't live to create Negro History Week, because in 1919, having come from West Virginia to Washington, D.C., he found himself walking down the street in the midst of a race riot that targeted African Americans and began beating them in the streets in Washington, D.C. And he fled and was able to run down an alley and get away from this crowd. And he might not have ever lived to go on to do these things that he did. And these are things that happen in the North. If we move a little bit further into the 20th century, we see the development of a civil rights movement. In that time period between the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that more or less decade of progress in which we see tremendous legislative change, we see tremendous differences in attitudes about race and its relationship to the rest of American society. And we see a kind of basis for an American optimism. And yet, even within that, we begin to see the seeds of backlash. In 1964, when Barry Goldwater ran for president, his platform was specifically anti-civil rights. And of course, he suffered the crushing defeat at the hands of Lyndon B. Johnson, one of the worst electoral defeats in kind of modern American politics. But just 4 years later, when Richard Nixon ran for president, just 4 years later when Richard Nixon ran for president, he's able to mobilize white Southerners in something he calls the Southern Strategy, which provides him with a margin of victory and the basis for modern Republican politics. And so 8 years earlier, when Nixon had lost to JFK, he fared poorest in Mississippi. He just completely got his clock cleaned in Mississippi. And 8 years later, in 1968, Mississippi gave him one of his biggest margins of victory. What had changed with Nixon? Not very much. But a great deal had changed in the politics of race and racial politics in those ensuing 8 years. And so, in 2009, in 2008, we saw something that we never anticipated seeing, most of us. It was the election of the first African-American president. It was shocking to everyone who saw it. As I kind of say to people, in 2007, there were only 4 people in the United States that thought this country was prepared to elect a black president, and they all lived at the same address on the south side of Chicago. And so the youngest 2 only believed what their parents told them to believe. But when we saw this, it was a tremendous moment of racial progress. Hands down. And I thought about this as my father, who had grown up in segregated Georgia, who was not allowed to vote. In 1976, he took me into the voting booth with him as he voted for Jimmy Carter for president. And as a child, he was trying to instill in me the importance of taking the vote seriously, because it was something he had been deprived of in his youth in Georgia, in his native Georgia. And so, in the midst of this kind of euphoric moment, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who works in politics. And he said to me, we're kind of looking at the celebrations and how people are amazed by everything that's happened, and he says, you know there'll be a price to pay for this, don't you? And I said, you're probably right. And he said, you do know that the Voting Rights Act is going to be gone. And I said, you're probably right. And we saw in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down in the Shelby versus Holder case, essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And again, we've seen these dynamics again and again and again and again. Kind of, they've become familiar to us. But I've talked a great deal about African Americans. This is not exclusively a concern of African Americans. In 1870 in California, there came to be a great deal of concern about an ethnic group that was bringing drugs, purportedly bringing drugs into the country and bringing crime into the country, and also stealing jobs from whites. And this group was the Chinese. And this culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which specifically targeted Chinese and made it more difficult for them to immigrate into the United States. And then in 1908, there was a kind of informal agreement that made it more difficult for Japanese to immigrate into the United States. And then a century ago, around World War I, the United States came to be concerned with a religious group that many believed were aligned with interests that were hostile to the United States, and that they may, in fact, have been engaged in espionage on behalf of these hostile forces, and that we responded by deporting these individuals and by stepping up surveillance of their communities. This community was Jews. And this culminated in the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act, which specifically made it more difficult for groups that had come into the country in the last 30 years prior to this, specifically Jews, to immigrate into the United States. This, of course, had disastrous consequences 15 years later, when many are fleeing the Nazi regime in Germany, and they arrive at the United States only to be turned away in the harbors because the Restriction Act of 1924 places a strict cap on the number of Jews who can be allowed into the country. And many of these individuals are returned to Germany where they are killed. And so we've seen these kinds of things in our history. We understand how this narrative works. The idea that we are being taken advantage of, or that there is someone who is getting something that they don't deserve. There's something we saw in people who study public opinion, saw an interesting development at the beginning of the Obama era, which is that some small number of whites, when polled, would say about disadvantages in American society, would say that whites are the most disadvantaged group in the United States. And this is something that people examining surveys would kind of raise an eyebrow about and go, that's interesting. But that number grew until by 2013, 2014, in some instances you would get pluralities or even majorities of whites who would say that they were the most disadvantaged group in the United States. Now, this does not correlate to anything that we know about American society. When we look at infant mortality, or life expectancy, or lifetime wages, or educational achievement, or housing values, or any of the kind of indicators that we find that we use to measure life outcomes in the United States, we see that they correlate to what we understand as the kind of old racial hierarchies in the United States history. But emotionally, this idea that had been so vital in animating American history had a kind of emotional appeal that was difficult for people to deny. And so, in the midst of this, it became alarming to see the dynamics in which we were so eager, have become so eager, to point the finger at other people and to scapegoat others, and to say that all our social problems can be neatly categorized as the result of one specific category of human beings. And it could be depressing to think about this. But I'm an optimist. And my optimism stems from the understanding that at each of these nadir moments, in each of these valleys, there have been people of conscience who've stood up and said that they believe in democracy, that they believe in seeing their fellow human being as just that, their fellow human being. That many of the people we admire and respect are admirable and respectable because they did their work under difficult and adverse circumstances. I mentioned that the NAACP began in response to a race riot. I could also point out that the ACLU began in response to the deprivations of people's rights during World War I, or that the civil rights movement sprung out of a tiny organization in Montgomery of concerned women activists who simply wanted to change, to reform the bus policies in the city. In Montgomery, they didn't even ask to end segregation after Rosa Parks was arrested. They simply wanted to end the policy that made black people get up and give their seats to whites. And out of this kind of humble aspiration came a movement that transformed a great deal of the way race operates in this country. In 1964, when Martin Luther King accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, he gave a speech. It's an amazing speech. It's worth listening to or reading. But there's a point in there where he explains the slogan, "We shall overcome." And he says that in singing "We shall overcome," they're not actually speaking to the people who would line up around the marches to jeer them, or who would spit upon them or throw things at them to try to discourage them. They were not singing this in defiance of these individuals. More specifically, they were singing this as a kind of affirmation to themselves, to convince themselves that something that heretofore had been thought impossible was actually achievable. In his words, he said that slogan could give their weary feet renewed energy as they marched on toward the city of freedom. And he said, when our days grow dreary with low hovering clouds, and our nights grow darker than 10,000 midnights, we will nonetheless know that we are witnessing the creative tension of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. That genuine civilization was not born in Dr. King's lifetime. It is the charge that he left us with after his death. But it is the charge that I humbly believe that if we are to understand history, it is within our grasp and within our capacity to achieve, and we will one day do so. Thank you.